Hi, my name is Michał Białecki from michałbiałecki.com, and today I'm going to briefly show you what is Entity Framework Core and what it is capable of. So enjoy! What is Entity Framework Core? Let's have a quick look. Entity Framework Core is a lightweight, extensible, open source, and cross-platform technology. EF Core can be used as ORM, and EF Core supports many database engines. Let's have a closer look. What does it mean? First of all, Entity Framework Core is cross-platform. That means that you can both develop and deploy application written with Entity Framework Core on Windows, Linux, and macOS. It doesn't depend. It works everywhere the same. It also means that it's more flexible than the old Entity Framework and can be used in more scenarios. Second thing is that Entity Framework Core can be used as ORM. ORM stands for Object Relational Mapper, and it enables developer to work with a database using .NET objects, and it eliminates the need for most of the data access code that it's usually required to be written. For example, if you want to use a table from your database, you don't need to write all of the SQLs to select, insert, and update this table. The Entity Framework Core will generate those SQLs for you. It also translates operations like filtering and grouping into SQL statements. So there's really hardly never scenarios when you really need to write SQL statements. The third thing I mentioned was that Entity Framework Core supports many database engines. Along with SQL Server, there is a SQLite, PostgreSQL, Oracle, and IBM DB2, and more. There are actually more database engines supported, and it really depends on the community and the companies that writes those. In theory, you can now use the same code regardless of the database engine you're using. So in theory, you could change or swap from SQL Server to Oracle or to IBM DB2. I'm saying it's a theory, and I actually heard about one case that happened, and it was flawless with Entity Framework Core, which is super. However, in the real project is a very rare scenario. How do you get started with Entity Framework Core? First of all, you need to install NuGet package. That's the one here. Second is to create a dbContext class, and a third thing is to provide a connection string. First, let's have a look at the demonstration project. So I'll be showing you an examples around Prime Hotel project, and I'll link this page on how to set it up in the video description. The project is really simple. It's just an API in .NET 5 and ASP.NET, and it's using Entity Framework Core. It has controllers, data, migrations, and models, which I will describe you in a minute. First of all, let's have a look at those 3 points that you need to configure in order to have Entity Framework Core working. First of all, you need to install a NuGet package called Entity Framework Core SQL Server if you're working with the SQL Server. The name differs for different database engines. Second thing is to set up connection string. In my case, I'm connecting to a local Docker database on the 1430 port. I'm setting Prime Hotel as my database, and here's the user and password. A third thing you need to set up is to create a dbContext class. In my example, the name is PrimeDbContext, and what's important is that it inherits from dbContext class. In here, you can find collections that represents objects in the database that you will work with. As you can see, I have collections like rooms, profiles, reservations, and address that reflects to the tables in the database. I have rooms occupied as a result of a view and guest arrivals as a result of a stored procedure. Now if I go to my database that I showed you that I'm connecting with, it's a local database called Prime Hotel, and I have tables that I just mentioned, addresses, profiles, so on, views, and stored procedures. In the DB context, you want to have a collection, a DB sets that represents database objects, and inside you would have a models, for example, a room. This would need to be a representation of a table in the database. For this would be representation of a rooms table, and you can see that those properties represents columns in the database. So when you have an empty database, you can just create your own models and your own collections, and this is the way you can create a DB context. However, in the scenario where you already have a database with tables and other objects that you want to work with, you need to generate the DB context class. A .NET CLI has a tool called .NET EF. You can accomplish this with reverse engineering. What I mean by this is you can create a DB context class based on your database schema. In order to do that, you need to install a NuGet package like this one. You need to install a CLI.NET global tool called .NET EF with a command like this, which you can type in the console window. And in the same console window, you just need to use that global tool, which is .NET EF DB context scaffold, and then you provide a connection string. This way you can generate DB context and start working with the tables you already have. When you already have a DB context and you want to have database in sync with the code you're writing, you need to have some kind of a mechanism of migrations. Entity Framework Core comes with a perfect migrations mechanism, which is very simple to use. In order to apply migrations, you need this first one, NuGet package, and the others might come in handy as well. Here I listed some of the basic commands you want to use. Okay, let's have a simple scenario where I have a room model and I need to add a new column. This column will be called number of windows. And now, of course, I would like this property to appear as a column in my database. In order to do that, I need to generate a migration. Let's see how I can do this. So, I'm in my web project. I'm running a console app. I'm running a console window. All I need to do is to use a .NET command. .NET EF migrations add. That would be a room. This could be the name for my migration. Let's see what it does. So it builds the solution and it's done. Let's see what changes do we have. If we go to the migrations directory, we would see that there is another migration added, which is called uniquely. It's a timestamp followed by a friendly name that I provided. Inside this migration, I have two methods. One is up and one is down. Up is run when I use the migration and update and execute that on the database. Down is where I reverse the migration. Both were automatically generated based on the changes I did to my model. So first one will add the column number of windows to the rooms table. To quickly verify, I can refresh the rooms and see that there are no number of windows here. But if I now use the command to update, let's see what happens. It builds the project and it's done. We can see in a database, let's refresh, and now number of windows appeared. What's more, we have EF migrations history, and if we select that, we could see that my migration, which is the last one, was executed already. So this is how it knows that this migration was run. So if I run the update again, it won't break. Now, once we have already Entity Framework Core set up with migrations, this is a good start to start developing. So let's have a quick look how it works. We can use the demonstration project. If I just run it, it's a simple API written in .NET 5, and because of it's an API, I installed Swagger to present it in a nice way. For now, we have a database that's really almost empty, but that I already added some profiles. Don't worry, it's a scrambled data. In order to fetch the profiles, I can use get method to fetch all of the profiles in my database. And it actually did fetch it, so it means it works. If we go to the code, to the profile controller, we can see how the code looks like. First of all, we need to use PrimeDB context. In this case, PrimeDB context is injected with IOC container. You can set it up in the startup class with a line like this, adding a PrimeDB context using a connection string. That's all. After this line, this is the framework that it's going to control a lifetime of the PrimeDB context. So all I need to do is to inject it. So once it's injected, I just save it as property or as a field, and this is the get method that I showed you results. So all I'm doing here is taking profiles and returning them as a list. What's more I can do is I can use filtering. For example, I can say that okay, but let's country be USA and return it as a list. I can do filtering with where. I can do more of the Lambda expressions like take, that would query only the top n elements. I can use group by, I can use join, etc, etc. So there are a lot of possibilities. I can use Linku, that it's familiar to all of the C# developers, to query database objects. How cool is that? Now let's take a look at the quick example on how the put is done. Put is an endpoint that takes the existing profile and updates its fields. So in here I'm searching for a profile with a given ID. If that's found, then I'm updating its properties and then use update to update the entity and save changes. This is an important method, save changes, because only if you run this method, the changes will be reflected in the database. When we are fetching entities from DB sets, they are tracked. So Framework by default tracks every change that it's done to the entity. And when we call save changes, those changes are reflected to the database. Tracking changes adds a bit overhead, so if you're fetching data only to view them, not to change afterwards, you can use as no tracking that would not track the entities. Another thing worth mentioning is that Entity Framework Core supports relationships. It supports all three kinds of them, so one-to-ones, one-to-manys, and many-to-manys. If you take a look at this UML model, you will see the tables from the demonstration project I just showed you. So we have a profile that has one-to-one address, so single address has a single profile. On the other hand, we have a profile that we can have many profiles linked to a reservation or many reservations linked to a profile. We can also have a room that is linked to many reservations, but the reservation that has only one room. So all those relationships are easily to configure in Entity Framework Core. Let's have a look. Let's start with profile and address. So if we take a look at our DB context class and go inside profile, we will see that it has a reference to an address. It's one-to-one. So if we go inside the address, there's a link to profile. Notice that in order to configure that relationship, I don't have to specify any mappings. This is done by convention. So only with properly named properties, I can just define relationships. If we go to profile again, you can notice on the schema that I showed you that it has many-to-many relationship with reservation. Let's have a look at this. So inside a profile, I have a list of reservations, and inside a reservation, I have a list of profiles. This is how it works. This is all that we need to define relationships. Let's now take a look at the reservation controller. So as you see, reservation is just an ID, room ID, and few dates. Also, reservation is a room that I reserve and list of profiles, so list of guests inside this room. If I take a look at the controller, it's nothing out of the ordinary, but the interesting part is how do we fetch related entities. So when we are getting the reservation, I'm defining that I want to fetch the room as a part of fetching reservation. So the room for the reservation will be always fetched. In a different scenario where I'm fetching the reservation by ID, I do find a reservation, and if it exists, I'm manually loading profiles and room. So you can define if you want to fetch for related entities right when you search for it, or you want to do it manually. Another example shows us how to add a reservation. Let's say I'm adding a reservation, and inside my DTO I'm specifying the existing room ID and existing guest IDs. So when I'm adding a reservation, I'm fetching the room with the given ID, and I'm fetching profiles with given guest IDs. And this way, when I'm creating a reservation, I can just assign my related entity to the entity I already have, and guests to guests that I just fetched. When I save changes, it will populate the reservation table with the existing IDs from room and profiles. I know there is much more to say about how relationships works and how Entity Framework work and what it is capable of. If you want to know more, go and visit my blog, michalbielecki.com. Take a look at the GitHub page for my demonstration project. If you go ahead and look at it, you will see a bunch of interesting articles around what's possible in Entity Framework Core 5. So you can go ahead, take a look, and explore. And also, I recommend you to look things up. Documentation for Entity Framework Core is really good, so you can find everything there. Just it's a matter of finding it. If you want to know more, I have published a book, Hands-on Entity Framework Core, which is a practical guide about Entity Framework, and it contains much more than I presented today, but I hope so. I'm sure it will be a good read. So if you're looking for something to read, take a look at this one. I'll post the link in the video description. Thanks for watching. I hope you like it, and see you soon. Bye.